This lecture for the U.S. presidency focuses on the progressive era and the progressive presidents of this era. And the progressive era was a point in time where both Republicans and Democrats were trying to take the reins of progress. And obviously, in the late 20th or late 19th century, rather early 20th century, there was a great deal of change going on, right? Technological change, economic change, social change. So the social climate and the cultural climate of the United States changed immensely between, say, the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century. It was a completely different place, and the United States had a different place in the world at that point. And so progressives really tried to take the reins of that progress. They thought that progress had become a runaway train, and progressives are wrongly thought of as people who didn't believe in progress. It was that they wanted to take the changes that were occurring, to take the advancements that were occurring, to take the very particularly the cultural and social changes that were occurring, and to kind of wrap them up into a very neat and tidy way of operating in the world, right? So there would be political reforms, there would be social reforms, there would be economic reforms, there would be reforms in terms of child labor laws, right? There would be reforms in terms of the practices of meat packing, right? There are many things that occurred during the progressive era that simply were a group of individuals who believed in progress but were concerned about the runaway train of progress, and so they took the reins of that as well. And so this is where we find ourselves with the U.S. presidency in the sense of the executive-centered government. And the two main executives who do this, obviously, because not everyone sticks with this idea, would be Teddy Roosevelt, who becomes the president after the assassination of William McKinley, and Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during the First World War. And these, again, you have a Republican and you have a Democrat, and they're both progressive presidents. They are members of the progressive movement, and they are members of that group of people who believe in progress but believe in making sure that it's harnessed, right? And that there aren't that corruption is tamped down, and that the little guy doesn't get lost in the changes, because it would stand to reason that the big guy or the more elite classes of the United States would be more able to cope with these changes than the little guy. And so there are these very strong leaders that step in to make sure that the United States, that the train of the United States doesn't go off the track, right? And to make sure that progress is harnessed and reined in and used in the best possible way. So let's move on and let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt and talk about the major ways that he changed the United States presidency, particularly in terms of the executive-centered government. Well, to say that Theodore Roosevelt was an extremely strong leader is kind of an understatement, right? Roosevelt is seen as one of the more masculine figures in the United States presidency, and he is somebody who really worked to get the job done. And much like somebody like Andrew Jackson, who had first started talking about the idea of the President of the United States as being a representative of the people, right? Someone who really looked out for the common man. Roosevelt really focuses a great deal on this during his presidency. Roosevelt obviously becomes the president after the assassination of William McKinley, but Roosevelt had been working for a very long time already on the idea of the reform of government. He also thought a great deal about the reform of society and the reform of the economy of the United States, particularly in relation to regulation of corporations, right? He focused a great deal on business and class excesses, and so in his legislative agenda, which he asserts early on in his presidency. He's very highly focused on the idea of really curbing the influence and the power of big business in the United States. And again, talking about that idea of progressives really wanting to harness progress, right? And really take the reins of progress and to make sure that corruption and make sure that the interests of the common man are not trampled by corruption, right? And are not trampled by excesses, whether they be excesses of class or excesses in terms of corporations, excesses in terms of political corruption as well. So Roosevelt was very well focused on the idea of being really the representative of the people of the United States, to be their agent of change, to really represent them within not just the executive branch, but through the entirety of the United States government. And it was really Roosevelt and other progressives, and again, they're Democrats and Republicans, that believed in the extension of the government's power for those very particular reasons. They believed that government was responsible for the social welfare of Americans and that it was responsible for economic prosperity for all. And these are both two very specific issues that Roosevelt worked on. He really also worked very and really tirelessly on the ability to influence the populace as the President of the United States, so the populace would then exert pressure and influence on the legislative branch of the United States, especially via the election process, right? So for Roosevelt, it really was really taking the great strides that the United States had made in the latter portion of the 19th century and really tidying it up, right? And really harnessing the energy here and using it for a common and greater good. As we've talked about before, there's been for the entirety of the 19th century this interplay and this struggle between the legislative branch and the executive branch, right? And the executive branch obviously is sort of feeling around to see what kind of powers it really has, what kind of powers that it can not only maintain for itself, but also in the case of some presidents, augment that power, right? But there's always been this interplay that's been a great struggle, even with people like Lincoln, who believed in the supremacy of the legislative branch, but also in terms of war powers, really thwarted a lot of any sort of power that the legislature would have, right? And using the emergency powers and the war powers to exert his authority. So this interplay is something that eventually would have to sort of come to a head, right? And we saw that significant struggle after the Lincoln presidency, particularly in terms of those Republicans who were trying to figure out whether or not they could at least pull a little bit of power away from the legislative branch and put it back in the column of the executive branch. Well, it takes somebody like Theodore Roosevelt to really find a compromise in terms of this. And his compromise, and we've seen other presidential leaders choose to try to influence the legislation of the United States and the legislation of the Congress. But what we see with somebody like Teddy Roosevelt is he really suggests that he and really the office of the presidency really has a duty to be a part of the inner workings of the legislative branch and to present a legislative agenda. And so this is the first time that we see a major legislative agenda that is set forth by a president. We've seen presidents introduce legislation before this. We've seen them influence legislation before this, but we've never had anybody who's had this major legislative agenda where he walks in the office, this is what he wants to get done. And again, being a progressive, what Roosevelt is looking for is reform, right? Reducing the power of corporations, making sure that there's the creation of legislation that would curb that power via antitrust legislation and regulations. And so he creates this legislative agenda that he calls the square deal. And rooted, this deal is really rooted in the idea of creating that balance that I've been talking about between the big guy and the little guy, and making sure that the progress of the United States, especially economically, but in many other ways too, that the big guy is not able to run away with it, right? That the little guy is protected in this process, and that the little guy gets its just dues and the things that he deserves and she deserve, but particularly in this period of time, he deserves during the this process of the United States really changing. I mean, this is, the world is changing as well, but the United States changes immensely during this period of time. We always think of the United States as changing during the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, but this is a point in time where the United States really has, we've had the transportation revolution, we've had our industrial revolution, and now we're reaping all the benefits of those issues, but it's really changed the United States and changed the face of the United States, changed the climate in terms of politics, in terms of socioeconomic issues, in terms of culture, so many, many differences. And so someone like Roosevelt wants to exert this influence over the legislature of the United States, and decides that, in doing so, he is going to push through these progressive reforms, and he is going to be the representative of the people, and a representative particularly of the little guy and the common guy, in making sure that the big guy or the big corporations aren't able to thwart any of their rights, or any of their opportunities in this very, very new United States of America. He does this a lot through policy. He also does this a lot through just intervening in issues as the president. He does this in terms of very overreaching and overarching power, in terms of sending federal troops to seize mines during labor disputes with the coal industry. We also see him struggling with the Congress over the conservation of lands, and eventually Congress, pulls his right to set aside land for the United States in terms of conservation. So we see him really trying to create a balance between the big guy and the little guy, and really trying to create influence for the American presidency over the Congress of the United States, but sometimes he reaches a little bit too far in terms of constitutionality, right? But the main thing to focus on him in terms of what he's doing is to recognize that, number one of the first full-fledged legislative agenda, it's the first one, right? But there have been other instances of presidents putting forth some sort of legislation, or making it known that they want something passed, right? Or they don't believe in this, that, or the other in terms of the Congress's agenda. So he really puts out this policy program that's in line with progressive ideals, and he's really trying very hard to create a place for the presidency in legislation. And it doesn't work really well. And of course, we've talked about this struggle already. We talked about this particularly in terms of the last few presidents of the 19th century. But what Roosevelt does that's different, and he would do this in terms of his charisma, in terms of his strength, and in terms of like how people are drawn to him, he decides to actually begin policy campaign trips. And this is actually going to translate very well into legislative success for him. But it's really this attempt to go out there and to use his voice and his words to get the American public on the side of his agenda, and for them to exert influence over the legislature of the United States, and to make sure that his legislative agenda gets pushed through. Well, what are the major precedents of Roosevelt's administration? And the main thing here, like we were talking about in terms of the legislative agenda and going out there and meeting with the public in order to get them to exert their influence over their representatives and over their senators. He goes out there and he does these campaign trails, and he goes from here to there, and he speaks to the American public. And this is what is termed the rhetorical presidency. It is attached to him in terms of the creation of this rhetorical presidency. And you will see subsequent presidents after him using a lot of the theories and a lot of the techniques that he used in terms of rhetoric. And rhetoric is a huge part, obviously, of the presidency of the 20th and 21st centuries. And so we have Roosevelt to thank for that, whether we like it or not, right? And so he goes out there in terms of pushing that legislative agenda and being able to exert influence on his populace so that that populace can then exert influence onto the Congress. And he pushes the idea that the president is not just the representative of the people, but he's also the leader of public opinion. And that he's going to take your opinions too, and he's going to take them back to Washington, and he's going to tell the Congress of the United States what it is that you want. And so you're not just going to exert the influence, but I'm going to as well. And he uses rhetoric extremely well, and he's a very good orator. And he really is somebody who's able to use this rhetoric, this technique of rhetoric, to create really strong presidential leadership. And so for him, this legislative agenda and this idea that he's creating a legislative agenda is again, it's brand new for the presidency, but who better, to push this through, right? Who better than this hyper masculine, really strong president who's been in war, been in conflict. He's been the vice president. He's taken over the reins of the United States after an assassination, and here he is out there going, I'm a progressive, and I am going to fight for reform for you, the common man, and I'm going to go back to Washington and I'm going to give him hell, right? And so this is what he does with the rhetorical presidency, is that he's able to use his powers of oration to get the public on his side and to get the public to do what he wants them to do, and to also illustrate to the public that he is willing to go to bat for them. And he uses what he learns out on those trails for pressure on the Congress, pressure to get his legislative agenda pushed through. The other thing he uses is the press. And we've seen this before where the parties have used the press to develop a relationship with the presidency. And we've seen this with a particular president in terms of really giving one sector of the press, and particularly one newspaper, rights to his presidency, and that would be Jackson. And so Roosevelt decides that who better than the press to portray to the American people and then bring back to Washington as well the not only what his agenda is and what he wants for the United States, but what the populace wants. So he's not just going to bring it back to Washington, the press is going to as well, and vice versa, right? And the press is going to keep the American public informed about what's going on in terms of his legislative agenda, and in terms of the presidency, and in terms of Congress. And so he uses magazines, he uses newspapers, he likes mass circulation magazines, and he talks a great deal to them. But you can see, these are the origins, right? We saw with McKinley that he was doing this in terms of his campaign for president, but now we're seeing a president use it during his tenure, and he's using it for his legislative agenda. He's using it for progressive reforms, and it works beautifully for him. Well, another major area in which Roosevelt set major precedents would be in the role of world leadership for the presidency. He clearly, this was starting with the McKinley administration, and he was the one who made sure that it was solidified, it came to fruition. But Roosevelt was someone who saw that the United States was on the cusp of becoming a global power. It was a major power in terms of the Western Hemisphere, and it could become a global power. And we see this clearly with the Spanish-American War, right? And the fact that the United States was able to thwart the efforts of Spain to maintain the colony of Cuba, and the United States was able to push away Spain and to really greatly diminish its empire. We see this in the Philippines as well. And for the United States, even though, didn't give quote-unquote independence to Cuba and actually established a protectorate for a while there, the United States was really getting its foot in the door in terms of becoming a major global power. I like to say that they're a force to be reckoned with, and they're playing with the big boys at this point, right? And so who better in terms of the presidency to lead the United States into this position of global power? well, he really sets some pretty significant precedents in terms of world leadership. He believes that the president should initiate policy. He believes the president should negotiate all treaties. He believes that the president should, and these were things that obviously were rights given to the and powers given to the presidency via the Constitution, and precedents had been set before this in terms of policy and negotiation of treaties. But he really adds an extra layer, right? And he is the person who suggests that the President of the United States should execute this policy and should execute the agreements that he creates with other countries, and that he should really be the administrator of these issues. He believes, again, that the United States has some pretty significant international duties coming up for it, and he really wants the United States to maintain its status at the very least, and more than likely augment it. And in doing so, he really suggested that the United States needed a really strong leader in the executive branch who would be willing to, stick his nose out there in terms of world leadership and in terms of really executing policy and agreements and making sure that they're complied with, right? And so that's the big thing there, is the President of the United States as being sort of the individual who says, you're not actually complying with this policy, France, or you're not meeting the criteria of this treaty, Germany. And so it really is something for Roosevelt, where he believes that there should just be one central figure doing that. And again, the big point here for him is wanting the United States to be a global power, wanting the United States to actually fulfill its duties in the international system, and suggesting that the United States is going to continue to augment those roles as well. He creates the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which we talked about before, and basically the Roosevelt Corollary is that the United States is really going to make sure that it intervenes in the affairs of Latin America, which it considers its own backyard and a very important place and region in the Western Hemisphere for the United States to keep its eye on, in terms of making sure that no foreign powers intervene there. But he wants to make sure that the United States sees and makes sure that it performs the right responsibilities and duties to the world and to Latin America as well, to intervene in the affairs of Latin America if the United States deems a particular government in Latin America to be failing or to be a corrupt government. And so we obviously are going to see many presidents throughout the 20th century invoking the Roosevelt Corollary, not just the Monroe Doctrine, but the Roosevelt Corollary as well, and making sure that the United States is able to maintain supremacy in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's terms as president end in 1909 with the inauguration of William Howard Taft, who happens to be basically someone that Roosevelt had really groomed for the office of the presidency. But by the election of 1912, Roosevelt throws his hat back into the ring, as does Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft, and it becomes somewhat of a three-ring circus in terms of the election of 1912 and the significant infighting, particularly with Republican factionalism. Now, the outcome of the election of 1912 is that William Howard Taft, who has already been the president for one term, loses the presidency. He's a Republican president. He loses the presidency, and Woodrow Wilson wins the presidency. And in the process of him winning, the Democrats also win the House and the Senate. And so these are very significant developments in terms of the government of the United States. And what I would suggest, and it's something that you see often throughout history and is what is happening now, is that it is really a unique and odd time for one party to control everything, right? And it is very difficult you either have that party steamrolling everyone in terms of legislation, or you get a stalemate in terms of the other party being able to get certain members from the other side of the aisle to come over to their side in terms of particular policies, particular legislative agendas, and on, right? And so the election allows for the Democrats to win everything. But the reason why is because of the significant Republican factionalism, and not just in terms of somebody like Roosevelt splitting from the party and challenging Taft, but there was just significant infighting within the Republican Party that is really going to not go away for some time, not until after Wilson's administration. And it's Wilson's administration and what he does, the Democrat does, in the White House, and particularly in terms of international and world affairs, that really lights a fire under the Republicans and really changes their outlook after 1920 and what it is that they hope to do in terms of a legislative agenda and in terms of the powers of the presidency. But I am skipping ahead 8 years here, and obviously Woodrow Wilson wins this particular election contest, and this honestly and interestingly is the first time that we see primaries in terms of the choice of candidates, and this is where we see the beginning of the majorly candidate-centered campaigns. So we saw that a little bit with McKinley. We see this a little bit more in terms of the election process for Teddy Roosevelt's second administration, so his second go-around. But we really see this once the primaries are there, once it's so candidate-driven. The campaigns are going to become candidate-driven, and then the executive office is going to become, or the government, I should say, is going to become executive-driven. Okay, so they kind of dovetail with each other. The other thing to recognize with Woodrow Wilson's administration, it's another progressive administration, just happens to be a different party. And that's something really to recognize and remember about the progressive era, is that progressives were from both sides of the aisle, and they had this commonality about the idea of making sure that they could rein in progress and use it for the greater good, right? But Wilson actually doesn't win a mandate. He doesn't win the majority of the popular vote. And so in his first years of his presidency, even though he had many, many grandiose ideas, particularly in terms of intervention in the world and in terms of the United States position in the international system, even though he has these grandiose ideas, he doesn't have a mandate to push them or his legislation, his legislative agenda through. And it's a lot of hard work at first to get the ball rolling on the Wilson administration. Well, Woodrow Wilson is able to capture a second term, so he is a two-term president. He has significant victories in the first term that, again, it takes a while to get the ball rolling on that, and then he has some major defeats and some serious health issues in his second presidency, or his second term as president. And so Wilson walks in, he's a professor of political science, has a PhD. He walks into the presidency with very specific understandings of the office and what he wants to do with it. He believes in really strong executive power. He believes that the presidency should really be the representation of the public, of the populace, and he believes that the presidency should be highly in tune with the public and go out there and really discuss with the public, what it is that they want in terms of legislation, what are the needs for in terms of their life, what needs do they have, and that he should then report that back to Washington elites, including the Congress, and make sure that what the public needs is pushed through in terms of legislation. His own leadership was, again, much like Roosevelt in terms of reform. He was definitely not a significantly strong leader. He was an intellectual, so he was strong of mind, but he just didn't exude that masculine confidence that Theodore Roosevelt had. And so Wilson was definitely, again, the intellectual and definitely the thinker, but he really didn't really become extremely popular with the populace in terms of them, really looking at himself as like a strong executive power, a strong president of the United States. And so he had to work really, really hard to persuade the public in many ways. He worked very hard also to use the powers of the presidency, to recognize what those were and then to actually execute those powers. But he wanted to make sure, and this was something that he discussed a great deal when he was a professor, was the idea that there should be a breaking down of those walls that were put up between Congress and the executive branch, and that really the president should be a liaison between the legislative branch and the populace, and that the president should really try very hard to be the voice of the people. And again, this stems from the rhetorical presidency. Another very good orator who sometimes spoke a little bit over the heads of the people that he was seeing in his crowds and on the trail in terms of his legislative agenda and trying to get that pushed through. But he was an excellent speaker, and he was just someone who, he had very intellectual ideas about, again, the relationship between Congress and the White House. He had very specific ideas about what we'll talk about on the next slide, the leadership of the United States in the world and what that meant for the United States and what the United States should really be doing. But his main focus was reform and reform for the people. And really being that president who's the representative, who's the voice of the people, and to make sure that there's a lot of transparency in terms of his presidency, that the people know what it is that he's doing for them, what he's trying to do for them, how successful he is at that. He uses press conferences, which we obviously still use today, and he brings back the State of the Union address, which had just become something that was sent off, right, on a piece of paper, and he actually goes and delivers his State of the Union to Congress, and that's obviously something that we've been doing ever since. So let's move on and let's discuss Wilson in terms of the foreign policy presidency, because that's where he thinks he can exert the greatest influence and ends up really not being able to exert much at all. We'll end our discussion of Woodrow Wilson's presidency and his administration on the primary thing that he's remembered for, other than being a progressive, which is his leadership in the world. And he ended up being the president of the United States during the First World War, which clearly illustrates why people focus so much on him as a foreign policy president. But he also has some really significant issues that he had discussed as a political scientist, had discussed as a candidate for the presidency of the United States, and as the president, regarding foreign policy and regarding the United States' place in the world. And remember that Theodore Roosevelt wanted the United States to put its foot in the world, right? That he wanted the United States to exert power and influence, at the very least, over the Western Hemisphere, and that hopefully he could push the United States to becoming a world power. And it's not just the presidency or the political system of the United States that pushes the United States into this realm and into this leadership role. It's also quite obviously the fact that the United States is becoming an economic powerhouse, and that the empires of Europe are starting to fall, right? And they are not economic powerhouses. The closest that you would have, obviously, would be Great Britain. And so in World War I, Woodrow Wilson is able to exert a great deal of influence on the geopolitical situation, the international system, even though the United States had initially been quite isolationist and had decided that it was not going to intervene in World War I initially. So for Wilson, throughout his presidency, he had a very idealistic understanding of the world and the United States' role in it. He believed, as many other presidents did, that the president was the head diplomat, but his main focus was on the idea of world peace. It wasn't supremacy, at least blatantly, the way it was for Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Wilson suggested that he didn't care about economic and geopolitical interests in the world and that he really just wanted to create world peace. But as we know, especially with the intervention in Mexico, Wilson definitely had concerns that went well beyond the idea of peace, right? Wilson initially is a proponent of isolationism in World War I, but eventually convinces the U.S. Congress and the U.S. people that the United States really needed to step into the war to make the world, quote unquote, safe for democracy, right? And so that old political scientist in Woodrow Wilson, and the one that studied international relations, and the one that believed in strong leadership in the world being able to thwart war and thwart military endeavors, he gets thrust into the role of being the head of the United States during the First World War, and is thrust into the spotlight as a commander-in-chief who needs to be able to mobilize his populace into being a part of this war. And eventually, as I said, he does this through, the suggestion of the United States as being this beacon for democracy, but it really is the German submarines that come close to the United States that makes Wilson be able to suggest to the American public that it needs to help Western Europe. It needs to fight for this larger cause of democracy in the world, right? And so for him, he recognizes that there are going to be some really major new duties for the president in wartime, considering the fact that the United States is becoming such an international player, such an economic and therefore military powerhouse, but also that the United States is given a chance here to become a major power in the world, rather, via this war. So if the United States can do a good job in terms of this war, or at the least not make the other allied powers angry, that the United States would be able to get a great deal of geopolitical capital out of this, particularly in terms of militarism, but maybe even in terms of economic issues and economic interests. Wilson ends up, needing to be the person who mobilizes not just the populace, as I mentioned before, but the military, and also mobilize the production in the United States, and mobilize, that World War II is not the only war that the United States supplies a great deal of goods and a great deal of ammunition and equipment to the Allies. And this is where we see the war machine start to pick up and start to really form itself. And Woodrow Wilson is the person that allows for this to come into play. He really sees the American president as the head of the industrial economy of the United States, and that gets intertwined with the military and obviously becomes that war machine that we talk about so much. And so for Wilson, once he gets the United States into the war, he's able to not only do his mobilization duties, but he's also able to really augment the power and the prestige of the United States. And the United States is seen as having won World War I for the European powers, even though that's not necessarily true, right? If you know anything about the war, the major reason why the United States was able to help out so much was the fact that the United States was coming in as fresh blood, and that the Allies were really tired by this point. And so the United States really, that rejuvenation of the cause and the rejuvenation of the militaries that were fighting that the United States was able to take a great deal of credit that it didn't necessarily deserve, because they didn't fight very long in this particular war. It's not the same as World War II, but what is the same is this idea of the production of the augmentation of the American economy. And the president's ability, much like FDR would do, the president's ability to mobilize all of this, and that was very important for somebody to be able to do. Wilson was able to do it, and obviously FDR is able to do it too. To skip ahead here, think about the idea of the Sedition Act. You read about it in your book. Note that Wilson, even though he was into the idea of transparency, especially with the press, that Wilson also had some pretty significant concerns over sedition in the United States, and really suppressed any sort of opposition to him during the war. He also tries to get legislative support. Again, he's trying to build that bridge, right? He tries to get legislative support for everything that he wants to do in terms of the war, and especially in terms of the industrial economy. But if the Congress is not interested in it, he's going to do it anyway. Okay, he's just trying to be nice, and he really believes that especially, again, wartime, war powers, and what the responsibilities are of the president. And finally, we have the League of Nations, which is clearly Woodrow Wilson's greatest failure. And the League of Nations is somewhat of the precursor to the United Nations. And the idea that the world community would band together to create peaceful outcomes to really any conflict in the world, and the United States would be one of the major leaders of it. And Wilson is not able to get the United States Senate to ratify it. So he's doing very well in terms of being that foreign policy president, and the president that really exerts a great deal of influence over foreign policy and over foreign affairs, but is not able to get the legislature of the United States to get on board with the idea of this league and the idea of this international cooperation and mutual agreement among the countries of the world. The Senate really doesn't believe that that's a possibility, and it may or may not have been at that point, especially as we move closer and closer to the era of Hitler. But the League of Nations was a really considerable loss for Wilson, who had already had a stroke by the time there was any discussion of it, and he's already out of office by the time the Senate does not ratify the League of Nations, and really leaving the League of Nations completely impotent, right? Well, the Progressive Era ends as Woodrow Wilson leaves the White House. And Woodrow Wilson actually lives for about 3 years after he leaves the presidency, and then he passes away. And obviously he was in rather ill health at the end of his presidency anyway, which affected his ability to be a master legislator and really try to push the U.S. Congress into ratifying the League of Nations. The end of the Progressive Era and the end of the Progressive Era presidencies really marks another point in time where we've seen these really highly influential, very powerful presidents, and then we go back into an era of much less focus on presidential power, not such charismatic and strong leadership. And so we see this for about a 12-year period after Wilson leaves the White House. The Republicans get the presidency back with Warren G. Harding, and we have a long string again of Republicans until we hit the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, and then we start talking obviously about the Great Depression and World War II. Speaking of World War II, there's a return to isolationism after the end of World War I. A lot of that has to do with our traditions in the United States in terms of no entangling alliances and just staying, floating out on this island here, but it also has something to do with the horrors of World War I as well. And so the United States really sort of pulls itself back into its shell, but it's not going to be able to do that, obviously, for long in the interwar period. And the United States is going to have to, come right back out again and be a major, major and significant player in the next World War. During this new 12 years of less focus on presidential power, we see the detachment of the government from the economy, which is not going to work very well, and the United States is going to have to, as it moves closer and closer to war with Germany and Japan, it's going to have to reassert itself in terms of the economy, and it's going to have to obviously have governmental intervention in order to make sure that the United States economy keeps churning out what it needs to churn out for the rest of the world during World War II, not just the United States. Nobody really tries very hard to win any major executive authority back. They want the authority given back to the legislature. That doesn't necessarily work, and what we see here in this era is it's twofold, right? It's sort of these two branches that are somewhat linked together in terms of legislation, in terms of agenda, in terms of actually being able to respond to certain crises. And so we see this duality in terms of the U.S. government between the executive branch and the legislative branch. But this is kind of, I hesitate to call it a dead period, because obviously we're moving into the Great Depression era, and that's not a dead period, obviously, historically, no, for the people who lived it. But in terms of the presidents of this particular era, after Wilson, you really don't see a great deal of strong leadership, and you do not see people who are always competent enough to be the president of the United States, that don't really have the intellect to run a country that is becoming a major world power. So that is the end of the discussion of those progressive era presidents, and I really think that it's a very interesting period. I love the progressive era in and of itself, but it's a very interesting period for the U.S. presidency because of the fact that you could have two progressive presidents and have one of them be Republican and one of them be Democrat. And it really shows the broad spectrum of the progressive era, and what the real point of the progressive era would be is sort of harnessing all of those changes that are around them and harnessing it for good, but making sure that one of the main things that they harness is corporate power. We'll end here with this impressionist oil painting that is the work of Childe Hassam, and it actually hangs in the White House. It's called The Avenue in the Rain, and it's a depiction of Fifth Avenue, New York, with all of these U.S. flags during World War I. And I'm ending on this, obviously, because we're in the interwar period at this point, and the United States is becoming a pretty significant power in the world, and obviously, as we know the story very well, it becomes a powerhouse, and becomes one of two superpowers in the world in just a few short decades. And so for the presidency, as we move into the more modern era of the presidency, we're going to see that war particularly fashions these presidencies, and that legislative agendas are very important, but the foreign policy presidency runs neck and neck with it. In terms of how the United States, before you could consistently talk about, well, this is the power of the president, foreign policy and treaty making and things like that. But as the United States becomes larger, becomes more powerful, becomes more politically and economically powerful, it stands to reason that there's going to be more exertion of those foreign policy powers, the foreign policy presidency, right? So it becomes neck and neck with the legislative agenda, and you see, and we'll focus on this a lot more from this point forward, of what I call the duality of the presidency, and that you can have a good foreign policy president and a not so good domestic policy president, and vice versa, or you can have one that's extremely good at both of them. And as we see with somebody like Woodrow Wilson, you know, in terms of interpretation, there are many different ways that you could see Woodrow Wilson as maybe being good in domestic policy and not so good in foreign policy, or actually not being very good on either side of that coin, right? And so, again, I end on this because of the fact that we've moved to the interwar period and we're moving through this period of time where the United States is not just the only entity that is gaining a lot of steam and a lot of power. The U.S. presidency will as well. And so in the next lecture, we'll actually be talking about FDR, and obviously Franklin Delano Roosevelt being one of the most powerful presidents that the United States has ever seen.